I grew up in Kellogg, Iowa, a small town of about 750. And it was a farming community, but it also was an industrial city because there were two factories there, a metal stamping plant and a one-minute washing machine company. And they did a lot of work for Maytag and Parsons and so forth. So it was interesting and a combination of both. And as long as I can remember, from the time I was first able to identify, my parents worked. My mother had a beauty shop in our home, and my father ran a pool hall, owned a pool hall. And then later on, when I got a little older, he sold the pool hall, saying I was getting too good on the back table, and became one of the very first people to start and operate a cold storage meat packing. And I can remember riding around the car with my father as he was selling farmers and the idea they didn't have to can their meat anymore, that they could have them process the meat and freeze it and make it available to them. And as long as I can remember, until they retired, my parents both worked. My mother eventually stopped working the beauty parlor and worked full-time in the locker plant. I worked there in the summer while I was in high school, and my dad, to give me some business experience, put me in charge of a little ice house that was across the street. And that was my salary. If I sold the ice, 25 pounds for 25 cents and kept it full, I had a pretty good allowance. So that was really a great experience. And the other interesting thing growing up is that I grew up during World War II. And I was too young to be drafted, but I can remember that as a very interesting time. The two factories became self-defense, defense plants, making parts for the military. And we had food rationing, we had gasoline rationing, and we had coupon books. And you know what? We handled it very well. We just went with the flow and adjusted. And if you needed a new car of any kind, you had to apply to the government. And if you were lucky enough, they give you a permit to buy a car if one was available to buy. But it was a real interesting experience because we saw our nation really come together closely. And everybody was working hard in the war effort. And this lasted for a good number of years after the war was over. And then unfortunately, we went into a situation, started in the situation we have now. Well, my interest in sports started in high school. You know, I played on the high school basketball team and baseball. We didn't have a football team. And one of the things that really stimulated my interest in coaching was my senior year. The superintendent of our small school came to me and said, you know, we can't afford to hire a junior high basketball coach. Would you be willing to come in at 7 o'clock in the morning and coach the junior high basketball team? I said, sure, I'll be glad to do that. And I just fell in love with working with young people and coaching. And at that point, it really shaped my career because I said, I want to be a basketball coach. And that was my focus for a long, long period of time. And I went to college. I went to a small college because I wanted to play football, and I knew I couldn't do that at a major school. So I got a scholarship to Central College where I played 3 sports, football, basketball, and baseball. And it was a lot of fun. Met my wife, Jackie, there. She was a cheerleader, and I was a football player, and I tried to get a date with her, and she wouldn't even take the phone call until I had the good fortune of running a kickoff back 95 yards for a touchdown. And I say, that got her attention, and then she would take my call. And so that developed, and we got married between my junior and senior year. She had finished up and taught in a one-room rural school with all 8 grades in one school plus kindergarten. while I was finishing up. We didn't have a car, and I was a 16-year-old college freshman at the time. But I went to college and was there with all these guys coming back from World War II. So I matured in a hurry. And by my junior year, when we got married, Jackie rode with another lady who taught at another rural school. And so she dropped her off and went on to the next school and taught. And then we were fortunate enough, when I graduated from college, that I got my first coaching job at Humboldt, Iowa High School, and she was able to get a job as a kindergarten teacher. And that stimulated our career and got us off to a good start.
Why don't you talk a little bit about your first car?
The first car we had, well, we were married for a year. We had no car, and we knew we had to buy a car, and we talked it over, and we thought, well, let's get a new car. It might be the only time we can afford to have a new car, so we're going to have to go in debt to buy any kind of a car, so let's buy a new car. So this was close enough to the end of World War II that you just didn't go to the auto dealer and pick out the car you wanted. You put your name on a list, and when your name came up, you took the car that was available, and if you didn't want it, you went to the end of the list again. So, as might happen and be our bad luck, the car that was available and our name came up was a Chevrolet convertible, more expensive than what we wanted to have. But it was a big investment. It was $2,100 for a Chevrolet convertible. And that was it. And we had that car for 3 or 4 years, and then we could afford to trade it in for a different kind of car. But it was an interesting start to our life together.
You didn't have the opportunity to pursue potentially a professional baseball career. Why don't you tell about that?
Well, you know, growing up in Kellogg always had a baseball team. They had what we called the town team, and then the person who owned the factories built a beautiful park with a really first-class baseball diamond with lights on it. And then the baseball program at Kellogg, their local team, took on a whole new dimension where it became basically a semi-pro team. And so I played there when I was in high school, and then I played in college. And then when I graduated from college, I continued to play on that baseball team at Kellogg for about another year. And then I was signed to a Class A contract by the old St. Louis Browns. And shortly after I signed that contract, the St. Louis Browns became the Baltimore Orioles. And I was all set. I had permission to get a leave of absence in my coaching job and go out to spring training. And then just about 30 days before spring training started, I got a letter saying wives and families will not be allowed at spring training this year. And we didn't like that. And about the same time, I got an offer to be a player manager in the Iowa State Baseball League, which is comparable to about Class A baseball professionally. And so they offered me more money and free housing than I can make in Class A baseball. So not being able to take the families, I made the decision not to go out. And that's one of the decisions I regretted not making. As I look back, I probably should have given it a good shot, but I didn't. And so that's behind me, but it's still one thing that I think about every once in a while. Fortunately, I grew up in a Christian home and always went to church and Sunday school and so forth, and that didn't change. And you know, I told people, you know, I went to church every Sunday and I contributed and even taught some Sunday school. But I said, you know what, that didn't make me a Christian. that maybe was a step in the right direction. And it wasn't until I was actually coaching in the University of Iowa and I had an opportunity to get involved with Fellowship of Christian Athletes and AIA and to really start to develop depth and maturity. I always led my teams in pregame prayer even when I was in high school, and I continued that in college, but still it was more on the surface. And then when my faith really matured, that's when I really became having the ability to share my faith with others, with my athletes. As the head basketball coach at Iowa, I had a lot of speaking engagements, and I was able to actually speak at a lot of churches and share my life and my story and my faith. And it just kind of kept growing step by step by step. And then later on, of course, I had the opportunity to be a consultant with the CEO Forum and work with 60 plus CEOs in the U.S. of companies that were anywhere from 100 million to $1 billion. And then took the program to Asia and worked with business people in Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Hong Kong, mainland China. Had a large group in mainland China, and was able to share the faith with them. And then most recently, I've worked the last 3 years with 12 young people, 28 to 35 in Atlanta, working for a company that I had worked with their CEO for about 25 years. And these were young people they thought had the chance to be top performers. And his charge to me was work with them just like you worked with me. Help them be the best business people they can be, but also help them be the best parents, the best husbands, and so forth. So it was really great working with those young people and not only helping them improve their business skills, but challenging them with their faith and the importance of their faith. Well, you know, it just started out like a first date, and it was really getting to know each other and finding out the values that we each had, and it was just something that grew step by step by step. And after a few months, I just knew that she was the right person for me. I didn't know if she thought I was the right person for her or not. But towards the end of that junior year, I finally proposed to her and she accepted. And our plans was to wait until I graduated before we got married. Then the more we thought about it, she would probably have to get a job outside of where I went to school, and we'd be apart for a whole year. So we talked to both of our parents, and they felt comfortable with it because we were both 19 years old. And so we decided to get married. We got married in June, and I just tell people we got married young and grew up together, and the faith just matured and just really developed into something meaningful as being a blessing to one another. And she's been great for me because she's patient and understanding, and she would challenge me in my faith if I needed to be challenged. And she's a great teacher herself. She taught kindergarten when we were in Humboldt, and then when I went to the University of Iowa, we were building a home, and she said, "Can we design this home so I can have a preschool?" And this is 1960, and there weren't hardly any preschools. So she started a preschool in our home, and she says, won't start until our children in school, and I'll be finished by the time our kids get out of school. And her business just boomed, and she had 2 other ladies working with her, and her school became so popular that when women got pregnant, they registered their children so they could be sure to get them in the preschool. So it's been a great trip together. And when I was coaching at Iowa, I had to do a lot of traveling, and she was usually at home with the kids, making sure they were right. And then when we moved to Cornell, I said, okay, you're going to travel with me whenever I go right now. And the NCAA was a blessing. The Olympics were a real blessing because we could travel the world together. And so it was a step-by-step process, but it blossomed into something great for us.
Now, what would be a few things that you'd tell your grandchildren or anybody about lessons learned from a long marriage?
Well, I keep it real simple, and we've talked to our grandchildren about that, our own children, about the importance of marriage and the importance of patience and understanding. And Jackie was with me one time in China, and I had been there enough that people knew that we had been married a long time, and the divorce rate in China is very high because you just write a letter and that's it. And so we had a question. They said, could your wife join you on the podium and you could tell us how you've remained married this long? And so we had a good discussion with them, but there are just two or three simple things we shared is, number one, don't close the day without solving any problems you have between yourself, because if you don't get them solved right away, the next day the problem is bigger and harder to solve. So don't go to sleep at night until you resolve any issues that are there. And don't always have to be right. And be very patient and understanding, and think of the other person. Think of your spouse as first and you as second. And she had her own comments, but that's basically just those simple things we've mentioned to people that we feel are important in having these long-term relationships. Well, I was hired. I was asked to come to Iowa as a freshman basketball coach. And because freshmen were ineligible at the time. And Paul Breckler was the athletic director at the time I was hired, but by the time I got there, he was gone, and Forrest Evashevsky was the new athletic director. And Evie knew my baseball background, and our baseball coach was Otto Vogel, a former major leaguer, but Otto was in his early 60s. And he said, would you mind, when you're all through recruiting, giving Otts a little help in baseball? I said, well, if that's fine with Sharm. Sharm Sherman was the head coach then. I said, I'll be glad to do that. So I started working with Otts and kind of as his unpaid assistant or unlicensed assistant and so forth. And 2 years later, Otto had a stroke and couldn't coach, so I was asked if I would take over the baseball coach, at least on an interim basis, till he was ready to coach again. So for about 2 or 3 years, I was the head baseball coach and the assistant basketball coach. And our baseball team ended up doing real well. We won over 200 games, and we were going into the last weekend of the season. We were tied for Illinois for first place, and then unfortunately split a doubleheader with them, and that cost us the outright championship. And then just shortly after that, I was asked to take over as the basketball coach. And that, of course, was my first love. So I gave up the baseball and took over the basketball, and I had a really top-notch assistant I brought in, and he did a great job because a year later I was in the World Series in Omaha. So that was a transition, and I enjoyed both, but basketball was my first love, and I was anxious to give that a shot.
You made another career transition into the athletic director's role. Maybe you can talk a little bit.
Yeah, I coached basketball for 25 years. And the thing that really I loved working with the athletes. I had some great athletes. I coached 5 guys that played in the NBA. And, but you know, when I was coaching, there was no such thing as a national letter of intent. We had a conference letter of intent, which protected you, the athletes you signed with the Big Ten schools, but the athlete was still a recruitable athlete until he attended his first class. And I don't know how many times we lost top-notch players in late August because other schools can recruit them, and even though they had signed a Big Ten letter, that only blocked the Big Ten schools. And that became a real frustration, and I just thought, and then this opportunity came up to go to Cornell University as director of athletics. We had one of our vice presidents was a Cornell graduate, and he recommended me to the Cornell people, and the next thing I know, they're calling me, and the more we talked, the better it sounded, and so I resigned then and took over as the athletic director at Cornell. And Cornell was a great teaching experience in a lot of ways. They had a big sports program, and it required raising a lot of money to keep it stable. But yet it was a great university and taught me a lot about fundraising and alumni relations and relationships with people, because the Ivy schools were really good at that. And I was there for 5 years and was very happy. And then I had a call from the president of the University of Virginia, and wanted to know if I would be interested in talking to him about being their athletic director. And I said, you know, I just turned down another offer with a Pac-10 school. If you'll call my president and get permission, I don't want him to think I'm out looking for a job, because I'm not. So he called and got permission, and we met in New York City at the University Club, and then I visited the campus and really enjoyed and it took me back into an athletic perspective I was more comfortable with, coming from the Big Ten, the Ivy League. It was back more in my own element there. So coaching Virginia was a great experience. It's a great school. A lot of people think it's a private school, but it's not. It's a state school, but it's very difficult to get into. You graduate in 4 years, or you better have a good excuse for being there the 5th year. So we had a good number of athletes that came back for their 5th year and got permission to do so. Ralph Sampson was not one of them. Ralph graduated in 4 years. But it was a great academic school, and the basketball program was in real good shape. The football program was not. And after a year, I was fortunate in being able to hire George Welch away from Navy, and 2 years later, Virginia was in a bowl game. And my first year at the USOC, Virginia was ranked #1 for a good number of weeks, and then their quarterback got injured. So Virginia gave me a great experience, along with Cornell, from an administrative standpoint and a management standpoint.
And as you were going along the way, making these career decisions, how did you go about deciding, should I pursue this or stay, or what was kind of the input, the spiritual dynamic that was in play that gave you confidence that this wasn't a door you wanted to go through? How did you?
That's a good question, and I don't want this to sound egotistical, but I actually only applied for one job in my life, and that was the first one I had as a high school coach. And as I look back at my career, it was very clear to me that the Lord had a plan for my life. I didn't realize it at the time, but I always prayed about these decisions, always discussed them with Jackie. to make sure she was comfortable if we were going to do that, because, you know, we were 10 years at one place and 15 years in another place. So in 25 years, first 25 years we were married, we didn't move around much. Then it was 5 years at Cornell and 6 years here and so forth. But it was something that I just put it in the hands of the Lord and let Him kind of guide me in the decisions I made. And eventually, when I made the move, it was very clear that this is what He wanted me to do. And it was a wonderful experience, and it's one that I've tried to share with young people a lot, that we have plans for our life, but the Lord has plans for our life as well. And our plans need to jibe with His plans because they're number one. And when we have challenges and difficulties we can't handle, it's probably because we've decided to go our own way.
You know, aside from prayer, of course, and Jackie, did you have a group of mentors or advisors along the way that kind of helped or assisted, or that you bounced ideas off? How did you include?
You know, it's interesting. I really didn't, and I'm sorry that I didn't. You know, I had good coaches at the college level that were really very good. I really learned more from observing and watching other people and talking to people that had good experiences, and understanding what they did and how they handled certain situations. But none of them were what I would really call a personal mentor. They were mostly learning from other people and observing what other people were doing that were effective. Keeping in mind that you have to be yourself when you're coaching and when you're an administrator. You can't copy somebody else's style because it won't fit. You know, you have your own style, your own personality, your own way of doing things. And while you can take good advice from other people and learn from their experiences, you have to adjust that to your own particular situation so it's real and personal and people know it's you.
Now you made another transition from the administrative role in the college ranks to an executive role at the NCAA. So can you talk about how that came about?
Well, that was another interesting thing. I was contacted to see if I would be willing to talk to the research committee. And again, we talked about this, and I thought to myself, well, you know, the NCAA has only had one director ever. This was going to be for the second person to ever run the organization. The other fellow had been there for a long, long time. I thought, well, this probably isn't going to amount to anything, but maybe the interview experience will be interesting. So I met with him in Washington, D.C., and spent time with him, and the next thing I know, I have a phone call, and he said, well, we've decided you have to be one of the finalists. So it came down to 4 people. One was a college president, one was a college vice president, one was, that time, I think was the athletic director, maybe at Air Force Academy, I'm not sure, and myself. So the big story in the newspapers were, this is the Final 4. And we all went to Kansas City one weekend and interviewed, and that following Wednesday, I got a phone call saying, would you agree to this, this, and this, and this? And I said, well, let me speak to my wife and talk to you, and I'll call you back. And next thing, I'm the new executive director of the NCAA. And Olympics was a little different situation. I retired from the NCAA, and started my own consulting company, and I just wanted to be just me, and I shared an office with I'm trying to think of his name. Oh, I shared an office with Tom Watson, a professional golfer, and with the contacts I had no problem keeping busy. I was doing work for universities and for some corporations and so forth. And I did this for about a year and a half or 2 years, and then the Olympics contacted me. Well, as executive director of the NCAA, I represented the school college committee on the USOC board of directors. Well, the USOC board of directors was 100 members, if you can imagine that. And I knew how political the Olympics were and what the challenges were, so I said, no, I'm not interested. And 6 weeks later, they came back again. We went through the same procedure, and I said, I'm not interested. And the third time, about a month later, they came back and they talked about the challenge they had at getting ready for the Atlanta Games and so forth. So I agreed to do it. I said, I'll do it for 5 years, and that's it. And I'll help you get through Atlanta and Nagano and be well prepared for Sydney and Salt Lake and so forth. I actually stayed 6 years because there were some challenges in Salt Lake where we had to let the chairman and the president and vice president go because of some problems they had, and we hired Mitt Romney, and I wanted to be sure that Mitt was able to get off to a good start and the funding was in place and so forth, so that took about another year. But I'll have to say it wasn't the most enjoyable job. I enjoyed working with the athletes, and we were able to rebuild the winter team into one that was really competitive. The summer teams had been always good, but there was so much politics involved that you had to deal with not only locally but internationally as well. And I had to make some tough decisions that were not popular. When you get 100-member board of directors and you get them to vote themselves out of business and go to a 25-member executive committee, that's a challenge sometimes. So it was full of challenges, but it worked out okay. And in the long run, I'm glad I did it. Start with the NCAA, and there are 2 stories there that are worth sharing. My first year at the NCAA was the 50th anniversary of the Final Four, and so it started in Kansas City, so the 50th anniversary was going to be in Kansas City. And so there was already a lot of planning in place when I took over, and we planned a major event to be held downtown at the Hyatt Regency Hotel, remembering the 50 years of the tournament and how it developed into what it was. And those developments were coming along real well, and one day 2 of my assistants that were working specifically on this and came in and said, we've got a real problem. We need your help. We can't get John Wooden to agree to come. And I knew John and I were good friends through coaching and through working with younger athletes and their faith. And I was well aware of the close relationship he had with his wife, Nell. She traveled with them to every game they went to, both home and away, and they had this little signal they exchanged just before the tip-off. And when Nell passed away, John just couldn't bring himself, he wasn't coaching anymore, but he just could not bring himself to come to a Final Four. It was too emotional for him. So I said, okay, I'll give him a call. So I called John, and he said, when I talked to him about it, the first thing he said is, Dick, he says, you know as well as anybody why I'm not I'm not there, well, I don't feel comfortable coming. I said, John, I realize that and I respect that. Let me talk to you about an opportunity for you to do this that will relieve some pressure. I said, I'll send a private plane out to pick you up, fly you in. You go right to the hotel. You'll be 45 minutes away from the basketball arena. The program will be that evening. We'll fly you back out the next morning. And you won't have to even come close to the basketball, because I said, if you're not here with the dominance you had for 10 years, this program will fall flat. Well, he said, let me think about that. Call me back in a couple of days. So I waited and called him back, and he said, if you can do it exactly the way you said, I'll come. So John was seated at our table, and it was a wonderful event, so forth. And when the event concluded, John reached down and tapped me on my leg, and he said, Dick, I want to thank you for your persistence, which was his way of saying, I'm really glad I came. And then the line was out the door wanting John's autograph. I said, John, I'll get you out of here right away. No, he says, I'll sign a few. Well, he signed every one of them. Probably took him at least an hour, because he asked everybody a question and wrote something special and signed his name to it. And then eventually, between Jerry Coangelo and myself, we were able to encourage John to get involved in the Legends of the Hardwood Breakfast. And shortly then, about 2 years later, he started going to the Saturday games. So all of this was a rich blessing for us, but in the long run, it was a real blessing for John. And the other NCAA story that is really interesting, and it has to do with that picture you see there of myself and President Bush. President Bush had agreed to do a video for us prior to all the bowl games, requesting support for the NCAA Foundation. And the foundation funds were to help athletes complete their degrees if they had completed their eligibility but hadn't graduated yet. So we had our own airplane, so we flew into Washington, D.C. to do this taping, and I usually went with him when they did it. And his PR man met me at the White House and said, you know, the president had a kind of an upset stomach today, but he's going to go ahead and do the video anyway. So I said, fine. But about 15 minutes later, the president came out, and we did it out in the Rose Garden with him walking through it, and it really went very smoothly. Then he said to me, he said, do you have to hurry back? I said, no, we've got our own airplane. I can go whenever we want to. He said, why don't you come into the Oval Office with me? Well, you know, I had worked with Ford, and I'd worked with Reagan, and I'd worked with other presidents. So usually the Oval Office deal is you walk in, a photographer magically appears, and you take your picture, you shake hands, you go out. You're in and out in 5 minutes. Well, we went in, and the photographer came in and took our picture, but then he said, well, sit down. And we sat down on the couch in the Oval Office. I was there 45 minutes. And we just talked about sports, because he loved sports and he had been a baseball player in college. And then he said to me, he says, you know, I've got this dinner tonight. He says, I don't really feel like going to it, but I'm going to go to it anyway. So I left, we flew home. I get up the next morning, we have just invaded Panama. I thought to myself, wow. Now I know he just wanted to have somebody to talk to take his mind off everything that had been going on during the day, but he'd made the decision to send American troops into harm's way. And it was a memory that I've never forgotten. It was a great experience. Right after I left the Olympics, for 5 years, I worked with the Beijing Organizing Committee and some of the big state-owned corporations in China. In fact, I was in China almost every other month for 5 years. They knew how to build things. They didn't know anything about marketing or television, and so that was it. And while I was doing that, I had a call from Mac McQuiston, who was at that time was with Focus on the Family, because that's where the CEO Forum started, and said he really needed some help, wanted to know if I'd be available to help him. I said, well, I'll be glad to, if I'm in town, I'll be glad to stop by, maybe a couple of days a week. So I did a consulting agreement with him, and it was obvious that, to me, that the forum really wasn't a fit in Focus on the Family. It was always going to be the outdoor, the child that was kind of left behind. So fortunately, I was asked to speak to the big conservative group that meets every year someplace, and so they wanted me to speak about China, China, a marketing friend or a dangerous foe, and the president and the founder of Focus on the Family was at that meeting. So I publicly thanked him for the support that the CEO Forum was getting, and so on and so forth. So I'm heading out the door because I had to catch a flight. I had another meeting I had to be to, and his executive director grabbed me as I was going through the door. He said, "We didn't know you were doing work for the forum." He said, "I'd really like to talk to you." So I said, fine. And I said to Mac when I got back, I said, "This is what happened, and I'll let you set up the meeting if it's something you want to happen. And then I want you to sit in it." And so he set the meeting up, and we sat down, and he said, "Well, tell me what you think." And I said, "Well, what I think is it's not a good fit, and we ought to find a win-win situation to move the forum out of Focus on the Family and on its own." And a month later, that decision was made. And they were very supportive. They continued to provide the funding through the end of that year. But that really, once we got it out, that's when the forum really started to grow and thrive. It went from about 50 to about 150 within the next year. And it was a great experience. I worked with about 60 different CEOs, and which kept me on the road a lot. And then I said to Mac, I said, "I'd like to start the forum in Asia if we can." He said, "Fine, go ahead." And so we had really good luck there, and it was wonderful. I really enjoyed working with the Chinese people. The people themselves are really good. They're really hungry. They're very interesting. And we would have sessions, and in the morning we'd deal strictly with business challenges and business issues and questions they had. In the afternoon it was strictly spiritual, their faith in the Lord, how to develop a relationship with the Lord, and so on and so forth. And fortunately, during those times, there wasn't a lot of pressure. I felt free in doing this and so forth. And in fact, I've been doing it for about 3 years, and I was in Wuhan, and we had about 40 people in Wuhan. And all of a sudden, the party leader from that whole district shows up at the meeting. And he basically recited my career to me. I mean, he knew everything about me. And then he said, "We want to thank you for what you're doing for the Chinese people." So they apparently recognized that, and they were very practical. If they thought you were helping them, they'd let you do something else too. And that, I think, was what allowed me to work with them and truly be effective. And fortunately, about a year after I quit going over there, they really started tightening the screws down again on the Christian movement. As a kid growing up, I always wanted to fly. Back when I was a youngster, there was the old Ford tri-motor airplane. And once a year, they would come into our neighborhood or into our Kellogg area, and they would land in the pasture in a farm, and they'd give airplane rides. I could never get my dad to allow me to do that. So he had a younger brother that lived in Chicago, and we were visiting there one time, and I finally convinced him, let's go. They lived real close to the airport, and I said, let's go out and take a ride in an airplane. Finally, he agreed to do that, and he went with me, and we took an airplane ride and so forth. And then I finally, when I started working, finally got enough money that I could afford to get myself a private license. And from that point on, basically, companies and organizations took care of me getting my other ratings, like the instrument rating, multi-engine rating, getting jet ratings and so forth. And it really became a blessing to fly. It was a real asset for me when I was coaching at Iowa. I might have practice, and after practice, take two of my assistants, and we'd fly someplace, and I'd drop one off at this point and one off at this point, and I'd go to the third point. I'd pick them up on the way back, and we'd end up having breakfast together about 2 o'clock in the morning when we got back to Iowa City. But before I started coaching there, I had opportunities to do some corporate and charter flying in the off seasons, which helped me build up. And so I ended up with a little over 9,000 flight hours. I had an airplane to use everywhere I was except the Olympics. And the NCAA, after a year, I said to him, I said, you're spending a lot of money on me sitting around airports and driving long distances to get to your place. And I said, I'm not going to tell you we can make it easy, but you'll get a lot more work out of me if we can have an airplane. So they gave me the ability to pick out an airplane and fly it. And so took a look at all the universities where they were housed. None of them very few are in major cities. And so we picked an airplane out that we could get in and out of most of those locations. And it happened to be a Lear 35A, which is that airplane up there. And I flew that airplane about 500 hours every year at about 500 miles per hour. So you know how much traveling I was doing. And it was a real blessing to me. And when I was at the NCAA, I got a call one day from General Lowe, head of the Air Command at Offutt Field. And he said, I'd like to invite you to Offutt to speak to our general staff and some VIPs. And I said, well, what's the date? And he gave it to me, and I looked at the calendar. I said, I don't know, General. That's when the Final Four starts, and I travel from one to the other. He said, well, if you can figure out how you can come in a half a day early, I'll arrange for you to fly an F-15. I said, what was that date again? So I arranged it so I could go on to Greenville, which was pretty close. And so he arranged it and cleared it so we could fly right into Offutt Field. I did a lot of afternoon training on exodus, how to get out of an airplane, how to eject yourself and so forth. I went out the next morning with a young guy who had flown a Desert Storm. And that's a picture of me of the airplane, and they had my name painted on the side of it. And we went up and took turns trying to get each other sick. And I always claim I won because I split his G-suit, but we were doing some pretty strong 7G maneuvers and so forth, but it was a real thrill. And then after I spoke at the luncheon, General said, if you've got time, we're going to do the dress rehearsal for the Thunderbirds this afternoon. And it was a short distance from Offutt to where I had to go, so I said, sure, we'll do that. So we go there, and they have 5 leather armchairs on the tarmac. One for Jackie and I, one for General Lowe in the middle, and his 2 assistants on the other side. And we watched the whole show right in front of us while they were taking notes. I said to him, they look pretty good to me. He said, well, there's a couple of things we need to shape up a little bit. We've got a new lead pilot. And so that was a wonderful experience. And that's a model of that airplane up there. That's a little plaque they engraved and gave to me in my first Eagle flight.
Now, you've been a college Division I coach, baseball, basketball. You've been an athletic director at 2 major universities. You've been head of the NCAA and head of the U.S. Olympic Committee. So that's a lot of leadership experience there. What are the key lessons that you'd impart to others that from that career that you could share?
Well, there's one basic to start with that's important, I think. I had, over my years at both the NCAA and the Olympics, I had either letters or phone calls or visits from young people that said to me, you know, what can you do to advise us, you know, about our careers? And I'd say, well, tell me what you're thinking about. And so many of them would say, well, I'm going to take this job and I'm going to do this for about a year and a half, and then I want to move into this job for a year or 2, and then into this job. I said, well, just let me give you one piece of advice. When you get that first job, work at it like that's going to be the only job you'll ever have. Because if you don't, you won't ever have that second opportunity. And that's kind of a basic that I tell guys, yes, you need to plan, but it's not going to work that way. You know, you have a goal in mind. You're going to have goals, but remember, if there's work along the way, you're going to meet the same people going up that you're going to meet going down. So you have to treat people well, treat people the way you want to be treated, be a good listener. Don't think you have to talk all the time. Be a good listener. And when you're listening, don't be thinking about what you're going to say next. Think about what this person is saying. And really focus on learning from others and learning the trade. And be very patient. And the opportunities, if you do your job well, the opportunities will come. I just hope I wouldn't make the same mistakes the second time around I made the first time around. And this is one thing I try to teach people about business. I said, look, if you think you're going to be perfect, forget about it. You're going to waste a lot of time. I said, everybody's going to make mistakes. And the important thing about a mistake is it can be valuable if you learn from that mistake and you make that a teaching situation. And then that's the best way to make sure those mistakes don't keep happening. And when I hired people, I'd usually put together a 90-day plan for them, things I wanted them to accomplish in 90 days. And then I tried to impress on my managers is that, you know, you need to make your people feel like they have an investment in what you're doing. So you have to give them some responsibilities. But when you have your evaluation periods, you need to make sure that they don't have a lot of job drift, that they're keeping their focus. Because I said we all have a tendency to have job drift. We kind of drift towards the things we enjoy doing and keep putting off the things that we don't enjoy doing. So I said, give them responsibility, but be sure they stay focused on those things that are important for them to be focused on. So those are just things that I learned the hard way myself, and have tried to make sure my employees don't make the same mistakes, and when they do, use it as a learning experience. Oh, you know, I enjoy all sports. I enjoy watching sports. I enjoy golf. I'm never a great golfer, but I think the best I ever got was around about a 10 handicap. But I've had some great golf experiences. I've played Augusta a number of times, and that's a wonderful experience. And I've done a lot of business on the golf course over the years, and especially in working with the networks a lot, and developing television rights, taking those television rights and making them work in a lot of different ways. A lot of those initial discussions ended up with them wanting to play golf with me at a special club and so forth. So that's been a good experience. But now I haven't played golf for a couple of years. I am going to go out and see, since I am using a cane now, see if I can have good enough balance of that cane to still swing the golf club, because my daughter, who lives with us, would like to learn to play golf, and we have a golf course right here that we could use, and a good practice tee that we could use. So one of these days I'm going to give it a try and see how it works.
Do you have any favorite places that you've visited around the world that
I think one of my favorite cities is London. There's just a lot of interesting things to see in London, a lot of great restaurants. Paris is interesting too, because of a lot of things to see there, and a lot of great food. Singapore, beautiful city. We've spent a lot of time in Singapore. We had some good experiences in Nice, an area. A good friend of mine from my Iowa days had a villa on the mountainside overlooking the harbor at Nice, and on our 25th wedding anniversary, he flew Jackie and I over and treated us royally, and gave us one of his cars to use, and I took Jackie on a tour, just a circle tour. Took her up to Munich, where I had been at the Olympics, so she could see Munich, and we visited Hiram Kimsey and some of the interesting places in Germany. We took a swing down through Italy, and then came back up that way and did a full circle, and that was a great experience too. We were blessed that we've been to a lot of different countries in the world and seen a lot of interesting and beautiful things. We were at Monte Carlo, had coffee with the prince, and then his son, who retained him, he was a member of the Olympic Committee, and I was on a IOC committee with him and got to learn him. He was a pretty classy young guy. He had a real interest in racing because of the Grand Prix they have there every year. So a lot of interesting situations like that from the world travel. But 2 or 3 really favorite spots. The message I try to give all young people is the most important thing you can do is develop a personal relationship with the Lord, because He's going to direct your life, and you just well be in lockstep with Him. It'll make your life a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable. And if you want to be effective in your life, you need to set priorities, and you need to stick with those priorities. And that's one priority you need to stick with. That's the #1 priority. And if you retain that, you're going to find a lot of other things are going to come along that are good opportunities, and you're going to have a lot fewer problems. The Atlanta games, the IOC was never happy with Atlanta, yet Atlanta was one of the most successful Olympic games ever.
Right.
The largest attended,
Yeah.
Right.
largest number of athletes, and of course Sydney said that we can't handle as many athletes. So before the Sydney Games, we had to meet and we had to cut back the number of athletes that each sport was allowed to take to the games, because Sydney said, this is all we can handle. But we built these 2 facilities in Atlanta, and then we had Georgia Tech and Georgia State dormitories. But they did, Atlanta was full of entrepreneurs, and they had the street vendors, you know, and that really kicked them off, and there were some technical problems. And that was Atlanta's fault, you know, they got real straightened out. But yet the games were great, and one of the interesting things was a press conference I had there. Atlanta, Nike came out with this motto: you don't win silver, you lose gold. Do you remember that?
I don't, but yeah.
And so, at the first press conference I had, that came up. I said, well, he said, you've got a lot of athletes that they didn't win silver, they lost gold. I said, let's resolve that issue right away. These are the top athletes in the world, the very best. And for you to win a silver medal or a bronze medal is an outstanding achievement. What if we had a contest for the best sports writers in the world? I said, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and I don't want to hear that topic brought up again at another press conference.
So that shut that one down.
Yeah, I said, where would you sit? Would you win silver or would you lose gold?
Because of all the stuff you've done, what was probably the greatest challenge in terms of leadership, of leading? Whether USOC, NC2A, at Iowa, Virginia, what was the
USOC, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Because it's such a political organization, both locally and internationally. And you always had a fight with the ILC. The board members always thought we were getting too much money out of it, and all the money was coming out of the U.S. anyway. You know, 80% of the money running the Olympics internationally comes out of the U.S. And we had a 100-member board of directors, and my challenge, I reduced that. I got them to vote themselves out of business, if you can believe that. And that wasn't a popular thing to do, but it had to happen. And so the Olympics could be more efficient. And so the Olympics were a big challenge because of the political process and the people he had to deal with. And yeah, this is a funny story, but it doesn't have any place in this.
Okay.
Yeah. We were playing UCLA in the old Chicago Stadium before they had the new one. And it was the dead of winter, and there was a foot of snow on the ground out there. And in the old stadium, all they did, they put the court right down the ice. Now they put insulation down there and so forth. And we ended up beating UCLA that night, and they went on to win the national championship. But at a timeout with about 4 minutes to play in the game, I happened to look down. John still had his overcoat on with his collar up around his neck.
So what was your record against John?
1-1.
1-1, okay. That's not bad.
We beat them in Chicago Stadium, and they beat us at UCLA. That was the first year of Walton. One of the important things that AIA is doing, which will really complete their beautiful campus, is the new Wooden Center. It'll be named after John Wooden, one of the greatest basketball coaches in the history of the game. And it will be have a major impact on AIA's ability to influence young people, both nationally and internationally, because they'll be able to host events on their campus, which they can't do right now, that require a basketball court or indoor arena. And this will just really give them the ability to expand their leadership role dramatically. So this is something that people really need to support. And they're about 80% of the way there, and they're going to go ahead and start construction, trusting the Lord to bring the rest of that revenue to them very soon. One of the great values of sport is the impact it can have on people's lives and their futures. It doesn't mean that the athlete has to end up being a great pro or a great college athlete, but it's the fact that sports will bring them together with top leaders. They learn discipline. They learn the importance of taking care of themselves. They should learn good living habits, and sports and ministry can do that because sports has the ability to bring people together that nothing else will bring together. I can remember working with athletes in both FCA and AIA, where young people come in and they don't know the Lord. And they leave on top of the mountain, praising the Lord and accepting Him into their life. That never would have happened if it hadn't been for the ability of sports to bring them together into special circumstances. So the value of ministry and sports at all levels, young people all the way up to the pros, is amazing and greatly impactful.